Hello everyone, I'm Zafar. I'm a senior at Colorado College. I'm a mathematical economics major, and I will be the libertarian speaker tonight.
Hi everybody, I'm Caitlin Sock. I am a senior IPE major here at Colorado College, and I will be debating the liberal point of view tonight.
We wanted to take a moment to talk about the purpose for tonight's event. For us, we felt that it was important to stimulate intellectual conversations outside the classroom, consider new perspectives that might be different from those that we hear often, expand on knowledge on relevant political topics, and bring forward unique ideas of this generation's thinkers.
And before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to thank some of the people that made tonight's event possible. First off, thank you to the lights and camera crew who made tonight's stage and live stream possible. Thank you to the students who gave input throughout this process. In particular, we'd like to thank Sienna Busby, Sam Rain, and Michael Bennett. And last but not least, we'd like to thank Zeke Lloyd, the president of Cutler Publications.
In case you weren't aware, this event is sponsored by Cutler Publications, which is Colorado College's nonprofit organization that sponsors responsible, high-quality student journalism here at CC through its 4 publications: the Catalyst newspaper, Cipher magazine, the Leviathan magazine, and Animasis.
So, what is tonight going to look like? We'll ask a question and alternate which speaker goes first, but each speaker will have 45 seconds to initially respond to the question. After that, we'll go to 75 seconds from each debater to respond, and then one more round of responses. And then if the question is really lively, we'll keep going with additional rounds. A light will come on above the speakers to let them know that they have 15 seconds left. And Michael will be fact-checking for us, so he will inform everyone if the debaters provide inaccurate information. So because he doesn't have a mic, if you hear Michael yell, we'll just pause.
And last but not least, rules for the audience. Audience participation is encouraged, but only after the debaters have spoken. Any audience participation that interrupts the debate will not be tolerated.
So let's get into our first question. Okay, this first question is for Caitlin. In the last 5 years, how much, if at all, has the Supreme Court overextended its powers by deciding on policies that could otherwise be left up to individual states?
Okay, a great way to start off the debate with a little bump in the night. So public confidence in the Supreme Court has hit an all-time low in light of corruption scandals and numerous rulings rolling back rights which have confronted Americans with the truth that the Supreme Court faces no accountability, no matter how egregious the behavior. It is clear that we cannot call an institution democratic if there is no accountability to the public, and that is the very reason why we need to add this accountability and oversight. First, we ought to impose term limits on justices because the entire point of a lifetime appointment was to guard against political influence, which now seems like a moot point. Second, there ought to be an enforceable code of ethics, the violation of which would make a justice subject to immediate removal from the bench and disbarment.
Of course, thank you for the question. When it comes to how the Supreme Court has dealt with itself in the last 5 years, I think one of the biggest issues that we've seen is the fact that there is a strong push towards making the Supreme Court more political. That's not how it was intended to be. The 9 people on the Supreme Court bench were intended to be the most constitutionalist people in the country. That's how the Constitution intended for the Supreme Court to function. But what we've had in the last 5 years, and this is to blame both the Democratic and the Republican parties, is we've had a push of both extreme liberals and extreme conservatives being promoted and pushed on as Supreme Court nominees. Now, Republicans actually went on and did this with 3 Supreme Court nominees, and I think that the Democratic Party has been backing that through their court-packing initiatives.
Caitlin, you have 75 seconds.
Sure. So I think we can both agree that politicization of the Supreme Court has absolutely ballooned in recent years. I would argue that, the very first time that we saw court packing with the Supreme Court was with Mitch McConnell blocking President Obama's nominations to the court during his tenure. And that was the very first time that we saw such blatant disregard for the way that our democratic system is supposed to function with regard to appointing justices.
I think that the first time that court packing actually happened was, and Michael can step in, but was actually FDR, the Democratic president, when he packed the court in the 1930s to get through a lot of his legislative agenda.
And this was the Supreme Court?
This was the Supreme Court
Okay.
when he basically put in a lot of his, increased the size of the court, put in a lot of liberals, and got his agenda through. And I think that that set a bad precedent for something
Sure.
that is once again being advocated and argued for. And once again, I'm not defending at all the actions of Senate Republicans and the Trump administration
Sure.
with regard to the Supreme Court. They did a terrible job. We now have a 6-3 supermajority court that is basically an activist court. And I think that that is completely abhorrent. But I think that introspection needs to be done both under the Republican and the Democratic sides on this
Sure.
issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would your remedies be then for the politicization of the court?
Totally. Well, I guess one issue that people have proposed in the past, and I've personally proposed to the Catalyst, is banning appointments to judicial positions during an election year. This is something that comes up very frequently. Both Merrick Garland and Amy Coney Barrett, they were election year appointments. And one of the reasons why they were so politicized is because it's a heated political environment during an election year. And so you want to make this a apolitical process, don't do it in an election year. I think that's a solution. But when it comes to the Democrats and their policies on this, you have to look at the track record, Caitlin, and they've completely opposed this idea, and they've done what's convenient for them, and the Republicans have done the same, and that's very unfortunate.
Look, I think that we can both agree on the rampant corruption in Washington on both sides of the aisle, but I think we can also agree that, in recent years, Republicans have had more of a blatant influence on the balance of the court, right?
100%.
And that's how we ended up with this 6-3 Supreme Court,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, and I think that there's nothing wrong with a 6-3 conservative court, but it's wrong. But what's wrong is a 6-3 activist court, because what we have
Sure.
right now are not 9 justices who are the most constitutionalist people on this country, and I think that's unfair to the American people.
Right. No, I completely agree.
Thank you.
All right.
Quick, Chris raised this earlier point that the FDR thing is correct. In 1937, FDR submitted a plan to Congress for increasing the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15. And so he was the first president to propose that.
But was he the first one to do it?
The policy, I don't believe it went through.
Oh,
He was able to change a lot of the members of the court, and that's what constituted court packing, what people
All right,
thought.
moving on to our next question about climate action. Zarias, what should the United States government role be in addressing climate change?
Look, let me start off by saying this. I'm not here to defend the indefensible. I'm not going to argue that climate change isn't real. I've taken enough environmental classes. I've taken enough classes in high school to know that it's a real thing. Now, here's the deal with it. I think that to say that the government, who is in essence very responsible for a lot of the environmental issues that we're facing today, to say that we should give them even more power to try and address these problems, I think that's wrong. You don't go to the guy who hit you with a car to fix you up. That's not how that works. I think that if we let and direct the free market to take charge on this issue, we will see great results. The Green Revolution is a great example. People thought that humanity was going to end because there was not enough food. Well, in the 1960s, the free market stood up, private research stood up, and we had solutions that feed us to this day and to the future. So
All right,
I think
and that's time. And a reminder to both the debaters, when the light goes on, that means that your time's almost up.
which light? That one?
The Zeke's light up in the...
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you. I was like, I don't know what light I'm looking for.
Caitlin, your
Yes.
response to the question.
Sure. So our response to climate change absolutely must include government intervention to correct for and prevent further negative externalities of industry in America and also abroad. A carbon tax on power plants, commercial and industrial sectors, and agriculture is more than justified given the emissions targets necessary for avoiding the worst effects of climate change. In the past, the United States government has been successful in sparking positive environmental change and innovation in the private sector. Just look at the Clean Air Act, which also helped to create the EPA, which prevented 200,000 premature deaths. Climate change is a result of decades of reticence towards regulation of private industry, and it's time to course correct to protect the planet instead of corporations.
Yeah, I think those are great points. But here's, I guess, my rebuttal, Caitlin. What do you think of the fact that most of the policies that the Democratic Party and the far left propose today, they're never going to turn into reality? And so the more that we stick to these agendas that are never going to go through the bureaucratic hurdles in Washington, and instead we're wasting time that could else be spent by the free market trying to correct these issues that need urgent attention, I think that that would do a much better job for the American people. I think you'd see results much faster and in a much more cost-efficient manner if you leave this to the free market and not to the Washington swamp.
And I think that you would be hard-pressed to find an economist who is taken seriously in their field who would say that the government should not also be responsible for correcting negative externalities. That is a tacitly, universally agreed upon economic concept, right? We can both agree on that, right? That negative externalities are a result of market failure and that the government has to be the one to intervene because the free market, when it's in failure, cannot correct itself, right?
Well, let me say this. As a free marketeer, I think that statement would be incorrect. I think that
Sure.
the free market, in essence, it can correct itself in a much better way. And
How?
from an economic perspective, we're both economic students, I think that whenever you see government intervention, there's associated deadweight losses. There's associated bureaucratic hurdles that lead to much more time being wasted instead of addressing the issues at hand. And so when you look at what solutions have been solved in America's history, most of them have been through the free market and how it's acted efficiently, both in terms of time and cost. And I think that letting the government take charge on this would be a mistake. In my
But
opinion.
what solutions has the free market actually instituted for national,
Well-
change as far as climate change goes?
Well-
How has the free market been directly responsible for a change in overall emissions when it wasn't prompted by subsidies or other tax incentives?
I got one word for you, and that's innovation. Innovation. We could if every single one of us here gets an electric car and drives it for the rest of our lives, but if the electric grid is still carbonized, that's not going to solve any problem in the world. So you want actual change with regard to environmental degradation? Well, the solution is change our energy sources.
You're
And that's-
absolutely right about that, and that's exactly why the United States government has subsidized green energy sources connecting to the market.
The problem is that we
And
don't
that
even
is
have...
when we saw an intense gridlock in the system for registration because there were so many private entities that only applied for access to the grid after these subsidies took effect with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, Caitlin, the concern here is that solar energy and wind energy and a lot of other clean energy sources, which are great, they are not feasible to take up our entire energy grid at this point in time. We need more innovation. We need more technological growth to be able to make them our primary sources of energy.
So
And I
why
think
hasn't that happened yet if the free market can offer all of the solutions?
Well, because of the regulations there are. Right now, as you say, the government is taking charge on this. There are a plethora of bills and a plethora of alphabet agencies in Washington, D.C. that make it their first job to stop these companies from going out and be able to do these research.
Can you give me an example of a specific bill that was passed that prevented the decarbonization of the electricity industry in some way?
Well, it's not about preventing the decarbonization, but it's about what you can do in a more efficient and time-wise
Sure.
and cost-efficient manner.
So I'm hearing there's no example.
45 seconds to present your concluding thoughts on this question. Zarius?
2 words, the free market. And again, my rationale for this is, look at the Green Revolution. There was a very prominent philosopher, Thomas Malthus. He said that humanity is not going to exist beyond the mid-20th century. The free market stepped in. Private research stepped in. Because they are the ones who are going to provide us the long-term solutions. We can shut down coal power plants all over the country, but if we don't decarbonize our actual electric grid, this problem is not going to see a solution in the future.
I would say that the perception that the government has completely reined in the free market when it comes to innovation up until this point, and that means that the government, in fact, is responsible for climate change and not the free market, is preposterous. The free market especially as far as greenhouse gas emissions go, has had free rein for a significant portion of time since the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't until the Clean Air Act that we had rigorous, enforceable standards on air quality. And so we have to look to the fact that the only time that we got real change with respect to emissions is when the government stepped in to correct for market failures.
Thank you. Caitlin, this next question is for you first. What changes, if any, would you like to see in modern American police?
Thank you for the question. So for starters, I'd like to acknowledge that policing in America goes hand in hand with racial justice. Today, distrust of the police among BIPOC communities remains low due to many factors, including the extrajudicial murder of unarmed black men around the country. This necessitates reforms. Firstly, I would abolish qualified immunity, which gives the police protection from liability for their actions on the job. Second, I would defund the police. Now, this phrase is misunderstood quite frequently, so let's clear up some misconceptions. As opposed to abolishing the police, defunding the police constitutes, at its core, reform, including reducing funding for police departments to be reallocated towards mental health and social workers to respond to nonviolent calls and the demilitarization of local police forces. I firmly believe that these reforms would do more to improve safety than any amount of additional police officers ever could.
I think I'm in complete agreement with Caitlin that the policing system needs significant reform. And one thing that I would like to point out here is that when you look at opinion polling on policing in America, you see that people are distrustful, they're fearful of their police. And that's something that should never exist in a democratic society. But here's the solution to that. In those same polls, and I'm sure Michael can back me up here as well, you can see that 80% of people say that they've had pleasant or good experiences with local police. And so if you devolve policing as a system to the local level, if you let community members be involved in determining how to police their own communities, I think that would go a long way. And this, again, comes to the argument of federal government versus localizing governments. And that's what I'm advocating for.
Caitlin, you have 75 seconds to respond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't necessarily have any problem with sort of reducing policing down to the local level. I think that, you know, in a large part, local police and smaller groups or agencies are easier to be held accountable to the public. That's just a fact, right? It's much easier to know the police. It's much easier to know their names so that you can go into your local police office and file a complaint if your rights have been violated. So I think that that's a great idea. I think that in conjunction with that, I would also suggest compulsory body cams, higher standards for the use of deadly force, and baseline mental health training for police officers on the job.
Thank you. Zarace, you have 75 seconds.
I think that the fact that we're in general agreement over this issue is just a testament to the fact that what we see a lot of times in the mainstream media isn't necessarily true. You know, people's opinions on policing are generally uniform across the country, irrespective of what political ideology they belong to. And so here's my I think, pushback to you, Caitlin. You know, the phrase defund the police has been used around a lot. It's been used since the 2020 protests. And
Sure.
Here's my concern with that. As a pragmatist, as someone who looks at things from a realistic perspective, do you think that associating yourself with such a brand that is in many ways negative, that polls poorly, Michael, again, you can back me up on this, but that polls poorly and eventually leads to a gridlock in Washington, D.C., because no one's going to vote for this hashtag. Because at the end of the day, buzzwords, sound bites, and TikTok trends, they don't make for great policy.
So instead of the slogan being defund the police, what would you have it be?
I would rather not have a slogan. I would rather have actual policy.
Would you instead have it say reallocate funding to mental health departments and social services and da-da-da-da-da?
See,
Like every single movement has had a slogan. Do you think that Nader's Raiders, anybody would have known what that had meant back then, had people not expanded upon it and explained who these people were that were coming in trying to get, you know, baseline safety regulations?
I think the way that slogans have devolved in our society is that they become the source of political polarization. If we didn't have these powerful and catchy slogans on both sides of the aisle. I think we'd all be much better off.
I-
I think that if, and I guarantee you, if you get rid of the slogan, defund the police, and you put forward a bill that does a lot of the things that you and I just agreed upon, Republicans would vote for it. Republicans, not just in Congress, but people in voting people in
What
small
bill
town
has
America.
ever the entire text been defund the police?
It's not
Answer
about,
me
it's
that.
about the messaging. It's not about what's in the actual bill. It's about
Sure.
the messaging. It's what the common voter is hearing out there. Because when someone in small town America hears the term defund the police, they fear for their safety. They fear that this is some far left push coming from the coasts of the country. I think that that's something that hurts us at the end of the day. And so
I mean,
the less slogans in our political system, I think the better off we'll all be.
is that not just an issue of people not being willing to do the extra work of actually trying to understand viewpoints that oppose their own? I think that's the real problem here, is jumping to conclusions that are like dystopic.
Could I have 2 fact checks, please? Yeah. Zoe, first of all, I'm an impartial fact checker, so please don't use me to support your argument.
I would not intend anything of that kind. If they're all correct, then it's
You mentioned earlier that 80% of Americans have favorable attitudes toward local police, going to KO is 64%, so it's a little bit lower than that.
And that's a conservative group as
Yes,
well.
Also, you mentioned that few people actually support the defund the police movement. According to Reuters, 18% of people according to a survey conducted by Reuters, 18% of people actively support defund the police and 58% they opposed it. Though white Americans, Republicans were much more in favor of directly opposing the movement.
All right, next question is about the COVID-19 pandemic. Zurias, what, if anything, should the U.S. government have done differently to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Of course, I think the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was an inflection point for a lot of libertarians, because it showed us how the government had the ability to basically manipulate a lot of the information that was coming out. And I think that one of the governments that I would really like to cite, it's a country that I grew up in, the country of Sweden. They had a very different policy towards COVID, where they were listening to the scientists and what the numbers were saying. And I think that the response should have been directed towards providing PPE and providing social distancing protocols towards those who are elderly or those who have pre-existing conditions. I think that population-wide lockdowns did not help. That's my opinion on the matter. And I think that Sweden is a great example of this. And I would encourage you to look at their numbers and their performance during this time.
Sure. So I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic was and continues to be an extraordinary circumstance. It was a public health emergency which necessitated extraordinary measures. The Trump administration failed miserably at stopping the spread with a mandatory lockdown, which leading experts in epidemiology did support both at the time and continue to support today. That is a fact. Whether you think that Sweden completely denigrates all of their research on that, that's one thing. But that is the opinion of a lot of epidemiologists today. That's an irrefutable fact. And I'm sure that Michael will call me out if I'm wrong. Not asking you to support my argument, Michael. Part of the problem, of course, is an individualistic culture in the United States.
Zurias, you have 75 seconds to respond.
Well, Caitlin, there's another question. We flooded in $10 trillion into the economy. Washington, D.C. flooded in. I didn't flood in. They did that during the COVID-19 pandemic. The effects of that are still being felt all across America. You know why interest rates are so high? You know why inflation is so high? It's because you just pumped in $10 trillion into the economy. That's going to have long-term consequences. And so when you look at the devastating impact of both economically and on a lot of people's mental health of the Trump administration and a lot of government's policies towards COVID, I think that they require a lot of introspection.
Sure. So I guess, okay, here's my problem, right, is that in the United States, we tend to prioritize individualism over the public good. I think that's a problem for our society. Obviously, there's disagreement, otherwise we wouldn't be discussing this issue. What I think that the government ought to do is to play a role in protecting the citizenry, sometimes from themselves. That's why you have to get a driver's license. We do have in place certain laws that are meant to protect the public. Not all laws are made to protect rights. Some of them are just for the public good, and I think that COVID-19 was a great example of an instance in which we failed to do that.
Well, I guess counter to that would be that there's a fine line or a distinction that needs to be drawn between individualism and personal responsibility. I think that for the government, it's their job to provide the most accurate information that they can obtain,
Absolutely.
that they're the most trusted researchers in the country or the world can come up with. But at the end of the day, I think it's up to the people to determine what they would wish to do. I think that.
But what if their actions aren't just affecting themselves?
Well, if
they're
you look
not
at-
just, these aren't just self-facing,
Well,
effects.
I'll bring up the case of masking. I think the numbers, from what I remember, it's that if you wore a mask and the other person didn't, your chance of getting COVID from them were 97% that you were not going to get it. And so you were basically safe in that case if you were wearing a mask and if someone else wasn't. And so I
Okay,
think that
let
it
me just
comes
clarify
down-
something here. So you're saying that so if I had COVID
Yeah.
and I was on this stage right now and you were wearing a mask,
Mm-hmm.
you would be safer than you would be if I was wearing a mask and you were not?
Well, look, here's what I'm saying.
Is that,
I
is
think
that, is that what you're saying?
mask wearing comes down to individuals. I'm a libertarian. I masked for the entirety of 2.5 years because I
Sure.
didn't want to get COVID. And so, but at the end of the day, what I think is wrong in this.
Right,
is
but
the
I'm trying to get
Yes, so what-
clarity on the statistic you
Yes,
just
so the
referenced.
statistics is that if one person is wearing a mask and the other is not, if you are the uninfected person, my chances of infecting you would be basically negligible. That's the statistic. So you don't need two people wearing masks to minimize the chance of infection. You could have one person.
Actually, and Michael, I hope you do fact check this one,
Happy.
because there is disagreement over this particular fact, that if you are the one who is infected, it is better that you wear a mask than the other person because it reduces the chance of somebody catching COVID. It is better if both people wear masks, it reduces
Sure,
it even more.
100%. I completely agree with that.
However, if the infected person is wearing a mask, they are less likely to transmit it than if they are not wearing a mask and the other person is.
Thank you. We'll wait for that fact check. In the meantime, we're going to move on. This first question is for you, Caitlin.
Cool.
What role, if any, does the Second Amendment have in modern day America?
All right, this is a great question. So what is often left out of discussions around the Second Amendment is the phrase well-regulated militia at the very beginning of the text of the right. This is the only time in the Bill of Rights where regulation is mentioned in relation to a right codified in the text. Thus, it is not only commonsensical, but a constitutional obligation to impose reasonable regulations on the exercise of the Second Amendment. I support policies like bans on high-capacity magazines, closure of the Charleston and gun show loopholes, which allow purchases of a gun without a background check. We also ought to prohibit bump stocks and other weapon modifications that mimic fully automatic gunfire or otherwise circumvent the few regulations that we do have in place around firearms. There exists no positive right in the Bill of Rights which is absolute.
I think I'm in complete agreement with Caitlin that there needs to be changes as to the way weapons are distributed and be allowed to be distributed in this country. And I think that the biggest thing is perhaps the inclusion of background checks at the local level. I think that a lot of these problems are local to cities and states. And if the federal government has a federally uniform policy, that will not be as effective as a lot more local agencies and local state officials implementing these background checks. I think that, and I think you agreed to this earlier in the debate, but I think that smaller agencies at the more local level are more efficient and get the job done in a better way.
But would you not agree that if we had a federal standard that we could establish a baseline across the entire country, whereas like leaving things up to local jurisdictions might leave a lot of these loopholes still in place?
A baseline, sure, but what a lot of the left advocates for in a lot of these bills that they propose and which never make it past committee is federal agencies having the power to go out and take people's weapons and enact these policies. Well, a lot of the gun control bills.
Give me a single bill that has advocated the taking of firearms.
I don't know the docket number of the bill, but I could.
No, I'm not asking for the number. I'm asking for, what's the general
if you
gist
look
of the
at,
bill.
if you open up AOC's website, you could read her policy on that. She advocates for federal background checks, and a lot of
That's
the left.
not a bill.
Well,
That's just her policy position.
Well, no, but this is the difference. She's a legislator. Her job is not to be making statements that are just on her website. Her job is to be making actual legislation. If she's busy making statements, I think she's not doing her job. And so
Look,
is not
I
the
think
left or
we've
the
gone
far
down
right.
a little bit of a rabbit hole. We're not here to like discuss whether or not AOC is a good or bad politician,
Well,
right?
she's an example of
But
the
we're-
larger problem.
Right, but my point being that I'm not aware of a single bill that has made it out of committee, that has been brought
That-
to the full House or Senate.
That's what I said. They don't make it past committee because they're ridiculous bills.
You said that
And
they don't pass.
They don't pass committee.
As
They don't
in-
make it past
okay.
committee.
Well, that's a little bit of a specification that wasn't added
I
earlier.
clearly
but
specified it. They don't get it past committee, but
anyways, I think that the whole notion that the Democrats are coming to take your guns is completely sensationalized. There is absolutely not broad-based support for the taking of somebody's guns. And anybody who does think that the federal government is going to take their guns has absolutely no idea what's going on at the federal level, to be perfectly frank.
well, Caitlin, the question really becomes that who do you trust more, the Washington swamp, who have put
Oh
us in
my
the position that we are today, or no? It's a serious
No,
question.
what do you mean by swamp?
Well, I mean the
Like, let's
bureaucracy,
get into
the
that.
entrenched bureaucracy of alphabet agencies who have been getting more and more powerful every single year. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fact. The deep state. There are elements of the
What
deep
is
state.
the
that-
deep state?
It's the
Define it for
administrative
me.
state. It's the fourth illegal
Okay,
branch of
moving on.
government. That,
COVID fact check, I just want to say that Kayla's statement was a little bit more accurate.
Thank you.
Cloth-safe masks were, per a study conducted by the Arizona Department of Health Services, those who wore cloth masks were 56% less likely to test positive for COVID, surgical masks were 66, and KN95 were 95% less likely.
well, it was not.
No, we were talking about like who's wearing a
Yeah,
mask,
it's
not.
about like.
We have a question for you about healthcare. What
Irrelevant.
should be the U.S. government's role in our healthcare system?
Totally. I think that healthcare and the costs associated with healthcare are a major problem. Today, we have $31 trillion in national debt. That's one of the highest per capita ratios in the world. And what do we have to show for it? We have no home affordability, no education affordability, and most of all, no healthcare affordability. Now, here's what I think is the reason for that. Now, if you look at all the bills, including the Affordable Care Act, healthcare costs skyrocketed whenever government intervention was asked for. And so if we make the system such that with a lot of regulations in place, if we have a free market system where people can compete, companies can compete, they can bring down prices, that is what will
That's time.
solve that.
Caitlin?
Could I ask just one clarification question? Is it a free market if this market is operating under oligopoly?
Well, I think that the free market.
I mean, that's a yes or no question, right?
I would say that no, it is not a free market. I
And-
think the free
and would you-
market
would you-
institutes perfect.
All right, and I'm willing to give up some of my time to clarify this point, so you feel free to start the timer.
Okay.
And would you consider American healthcare to be existing in an oligopoly market structure?
Right now, yes, because of government
Okay,
regulations.
thank you. So we're not in the free market. We've established that, right?
Yes, 100%.
So we need to do something to the government has to intervene to restore competition because you agree that we are in a market failure with regards to the healthcare industry.
And that market
again,
failure is
excuse me, this
because
is my time.
Well, you wanted to have this
Excuse
as
me.
an interactive
I asked you a question. I did not ask you a second question. Thank you. I would put a limit for profit margins on medical facilities as far as what they are allowed to profiteer off of people's death.
Look, the question really becomes, we are in an oligopoly, but the reason we are in this mess is because of government intervention.
How?
The solution, just look at the Affordable Care Act. Look at the
But how did that
mandate.
lead to an oligopoly?
Well, it
Sorry.
led to
I was just
it led to skyrocketing demand and mandatory insurance for a lot of people who otherwise would have gotten a lot cheaper insurance. And so that's what really led to sky shooting costs. And that's something that I think is because of increased government intervention. And so I don't think that you can solve the problem by going back to the person who caused it in the first place.
Could we get a fact check on the causality of the ACA with regards to healthcare costs?
You're more than welcome to look up the costs of healthcare after the ACA.
Is it my time or is it still?
We're still in, sorry.
Go right ahead.
Well, so I guess, Caitlin, to me, the problem then becomes that would you not be amenable to the fact that if we had a free market where people were, or companies were perfectly competing for health insurance in the health insurance market, that would be a better system than what we have today?
The free market is a utopian ideal. It has never in the history of mankind been seen through to reality. No economist would say that any society in the world has ever been a perfectly free market. That is a fact.
That is because of government.
No, it's literally not. It's because markets naturally do consolidate a lot of the time. So without government intervention, unless government intervention is perfectly tuned with market failures like the development of an oligopoly, a free market can never occur. That is the economic fact of the matter. I think that a lot of Americans, especially libertarians and free marketists, marketeers, excuse me. I think a lot of free marketeers get this key point wrong, that the free market is a utopian ideal created by economists to explain what would happen if we had perfect competition, not any real state of any economy ever to exist.
We're going to move on.
Healthcare generally costs were on the rise before ACA coverage began. However, few research papers have said that it's pretty well determined that they slowed the rise of those costs pretty substantially.
Okay, yeah, so, okay.
I would debate that, but I'm not debating Michael. So.
Okay, Caitlin, this question is for you.
Sure.
Considering the recent military exercises surrounding the island of Taiwan, what diplomatic approach should the United States use?
I think that Taiwan deserves our recognition and defense against China's attempts to reunify the independently governed island. I think that principles are not principles if you can't stand up for them when you're tested. If we are to be, as we claim, a bastion of democracy and self-determination in the world, then it is absolutely crucial that we stand by Taiwan in its ongoing fight for independence. I think that what we've seen with Ukraine is that an indirect support structure can still provide aid to regimes that we'd like to see succeed without instigating, Cold War II, right? So we see that indirect support can work without instigating, an international conflict between superpowers, is my opinion.
Thank you.
I think this is another area where a lot of progressives and libertarians are in agreement that, yes, something needs to be done, but we can't risk World War III for it. And I think that, and Caitlin, you're free to rebut on this, but I think that a proposal where we enact and change our trade policies and enact a system of strategic protectionism where we're not dependent on our adversaries such as Russia and China for important goods and services, I think that would go a long way towards helping our allies such as Taiwan and Ukraine who are being threatened and literally invaded by these adversaries. And so these policies, if they are enacted, and one of the biggest examples is chip manufacturing. I think that if the US government can take a lot of the regulations off of chip manufacturing here in the US, we would not be dependent on China for chips.
Sure, I understand the logic behind that point. I really do get where you're coming from there. My perspective is that our economic entanglement with China is exactly what prevents World War III happening with China. Because if our economy tanks, so does theirs. Our economies are so convolutedly entangled that it would make no sense for China to move on the United States in a way that would cause an economic crash. I mean, it just seems kind of absurd to me, the proposition that China would do something that is so against their own interests. But I do understand the impulse for strategic protectionism, I do. And I think that, certain things like chip manufacturing that are essential for, defense, I think that that's perfectly fine, but I think that trying to disentangle our economies would destabilize international relations.
I'm a libertarian. My first words were free trade. But
yeah, and now all of a sudden you want to restrict it, huh?
No, it's again to your point. I think it's strategically important industries that must be protected, not a economy-wide tariff being imposed on China. I would not advocate or be in support of that.
All right. For this next question, we're going to ask you both just to raise your hands in response to this question. Do you believe that we should decriminalize drugs? Okay, so we have a follow-up question that will hopefully result in more discussion. This is for Caitlin. What should the government's responsibility be in regards to harm reduction for drug overdose?
Sure. So if the goal is to reduce drug abuse in the United States, it is absolutely imperative in light of rising overdose deaths and increasingly dangerous and highly concentrated opioids that we change our framing of illicit drugs from a criminal justice approach to one of public health. Now, just a few initiatives that I think would be helpful as far as harm reduction goes is if we were to enact free drug treatment facilities at the federal, whether from the federal, state, or local governments, also needle exchange programs, safe injection sites, and other harm reduction measures. It really is the best way to reduce overdose deaths and to reduce drug recidivism and achieve actual treatment in a country. We see all kinds of other nations who have done this exact same policy.
I think that if you look at the opinion polls on marijuana legalization, over 70% of Americans support it. And despite that fact that we are still in this state where people are being locked up in federal prisons because of marijuana usage, I think that that is completely abhorrent. And I think that when it comes to the government's role in this, if you start to legalize and regulate things like cocaine, things like other harder drugs that have higher fatality rates, you will see a drop in those fatality rates. Fentanyl usage will go down extremely significantly in a very short amount of time. I think that government legalizing these drugs and creating taxable industries that are well regulated, and again, not by federal alphabet agencies, but at the local level, that would be great for the country.
Sure, I think there do need to be like federal guidelines as far, if we were to legalize drugs, we do have to have federal guidelines that regulate, the concentration of these opioids or other, dangerous drugs that, are highly addictive or are capable of causing overdose. I mean, I hope that we can agree that like the Food and Drug Administration would have to have some sort of say over the lethality of these legal drugs that are hitting the market, right? At least I would hope so.
Yes, I completely agree.
But in any case, yeah. And I also think that, we do owe those who have been incarcerated as a result of the war on drugs some form of reparations for the time that they've spent in prison for nonviolent crimes, for the repeated and absolutely oppressive presence of police in their communities. The war on drugs has left some very, very profound scars in the American public around trust of the police and around the safety of their own communities.
Well, I think that the thing that we potentially disagree on is how are these guidelines going to be enforced? I agree that FDA, I trust those guys up there. They've got fancier PhDs than
Aren't they an alphabet agency though?
Well, the thing is enforcement. The thing is enforcement of these guidelines. Sure. I think that the enforcement should be left solely up to local and state governments because they would do a much better job at enforcing them. If you make the DEA in charge of regulating these industries, I think that would be a terrible proposition and lead to potentially even worse outcomes than what we have today.
I would 100% agree. I think that the assorted commerce authorities would be much better suited to this kind of regulation and enforcement, and it would be civil rather than criminal.
Yeah, completely agree.
Thank you. This next question is for Therese. Starting in 2023, Colorado now offers universal pre-K. Should universal pre-K be a program that is provided by government funding?
As a libertarian, I am a firm believer in the concept of equal opportunity. I think that people should be given an equal playing field from which they can build on in their lives. And when it comes to the case of universal pre-K, I think that there's a very strong argument for its existence. But again, it has to be devolved at the local and state levels. If you have the Department of Education going out and enacting these programs all over the country, you'll have a very inefficient and costly system. Whereas if you use local and state funding for universal pre-K, which is something that is being currently considered in some states and localities, that would do a much more efficient job at achieving the outcome of equality of opportunity.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Yeah, so I was, hoping we could find some common ground as far as like, could we agree on a federal requirement of some pre-K provision at the state and local level, hands off as far as the structure of that, but that every state or municipality provides some form of pre-K.
For people under a certain income bracket, I would completely agree with that.
Interesting. Okay. I think that.
Well, because we wouldn't want to,
Excuse
give
me.
subsidy.
This is my time.
My apologies. Please continue.
Thank you, good sir. So I would just say that, universal pre-K, it helps reduce crime later in life. It helps narrow the achievement gap that we see based on wealth in the United States. And I think that we can totally agree that education is crucial as the great equalizer in American society. At least that's what it's supposed to be. But it can't be the great equalizer if we're only allowing some people access to some education. And I think that argument holds for higher education as well, but I don't want to get too deep down that rabbit hole.
The only point I would have wanted to make there, and sorry for interjecting, but
No, it's okay.
the point that I wanted to make was that I would support federal guidelines on that, but having an income limit. Because at the end of the day, I think that government programs should be directed to those in need, not
Agreed.
to the entire population. I don't think that everyone in the country requires universal pre-K for their child. I think a lot of people can pay for it. And when we look at the national debt numbers and national deficit, I think that those things should be taken into consideration. But I agree that there should be a federal stipulation, but that is enforced by
It's
the
like a
local.
public option rather than.
Yeah, but it would have to be for under a certain
Right,
income bracket and at the local and state level. That I would completely support that.
Sure.
All right, so these are all the questions we have prepared. Zeke Lloyd, would you like to come down and deliver some closing remarks?
We got a bunch of popcorn left over. So grab some on your way out. But outside of that, thanks so much for coming, everyone.
You guys, your hands up.
Everyone, see you.
Oh, yeah, well
That
done.
was an excellent debate.
Yeah, it was.
Really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much
Really
for
enjoyed it.
coming. We get lights up. Great debate.